ahead and
Tuesday was a mess.
kick us off, but I'm really excited to be having this conversation today, particularly in this moment. And over the last year or so, my co-founder Rostam and I we've launched World Within, which is our humanitarian organization, and we're focused on investing in communities that are underserved, particularly around issues of food security and climate security and financial inclusion. And I've been really persuaded that, particularly in America, we have enough material wealth and resources to ensure economic opportunity for all people. And everywhere we look, we see these two fundamental challenges. And one is of capital. We don't invest nearly enough in communities that need it the most. And the second is of capacity. We need new infrastructure, new policies, new narratives that actually value people and communities for who and what they are. And Andre's work, which you'll really hear about today, touches on both of these challenges. And Andre's had a pretty phenomenal career at Brookings, at Emory University, unpacking the systemic reforms that are really, really necessary for us to make the America we believe in possible. And Andre has a new book out, which is really exciting, called Know Your Price. And we'll be sure to send out a link in addition to the cover you can see behind his face, if you can see his face right now, for folks who want to buy it, read it, learn more. And there's some stunning statistics he has uncovered in the housing market, statistics that really deepen the fact that not only have we had a history of redlining, a history of discrimination and lending practices, but also that there are real quantifiable effects that we can see in the values of homes that are owned by Black people today. And so he talks about this in different cities, in Detroit, Birmingham, New Orleans, DC, right here in Atlanta. And one of my favorite quotes is by Thoreau. He says that it doesn't matter what we look at, it matters what we can see. And so much of what inspires me about Andre and his work is that he's challenging not just material devaluation, but also the devaluation of Black lives. And he's challenging us to better invest in communities that are most proximate to the challenges we face. So I know for me, the work I do is really personal. I know for Andre it is too. So Andre, I'd love for you to kick us off with your story, why this work is your calling, and what you've discovered by doing it.
Well, thank you, Mehul, for having me today. It's a great honor. It's always good to be in Atlanta, at least virtually. And thank you all for having me. I'm going to sort of go freestyle just a little bit, and evoke the name Killer Mike. A few weeks ago, when the uprising took hold in Atlanta, he gave an impassioned speech to not burn down the buildings and businesses in and around Atlanta, and it was truly heartfelt. No one wants to see buildings being burned. No one wants to see those services removed. But my immediate response was that as long as the value of protesting is perceived to be higher than the value of the actual property, people will seek to bring voice to an issue above the properties that are right around them. And there's a lot of truth to that. A lot of my research shows that the owner-occupied homes in and around Atlanta and across the country are undervalued by a significant amount. The study that anchors my book, we looked at home prices in Black neighborhoods where the share of the Black population was greater than 50%, and we compared them to places where the share of the population, the Black population, was less than 1%. And we controlled for education, crime, walkability, and all those fancy Zillow metrics. And what we found astounds. The homes in Black neighborhoods are devalued by 23%, about $48,000 per home. And that accumulatively amounts to about $156 billion. That $156 billion should have gone to families to send their kids to college. In fact, it would have financed more than 8 million four-year degrees at public universities. It should have funded started up businesses. In fact, it would have, it's the amount that would have started up more than 4 million businesses based on the average amount that Black startup businesses. It's a big amount. It could have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over. It would have covered nearly all of Hurricane Katrina damage. And I say that to say that we have an opportunity today to restore that value in Black communities. When people burn things, it's because they're not getting the true value from those services. We talk a lot about cost benefit analysis in think tanks, and it's clear that in people's mind, they've calculated, you know, it's better off for me to bring attention to the structural inequality that reduces the value of my businesses, my services, my schools, and to take that risk. And if we really want to make sure that folks don't want to burn something down, we need to restore that value that's been extracted simply because of racism. I know that's a pretty controversial statement, but I think it's plain as day in terms of why we see the kind of protests sometimes that turn violent and in nature. But that I just wanted to open that just to be clear that the undervaluing, the devaluing, I should say, the purposeful, and I do mean purposeful depression of value in properties has enormous implications that we should not ignore, that we must stand up and fight. I'm just a little bit about myself. I have family in Atlanta. The reason why I chose Atlanta, I
think that's what we call a cliffhanger.
Yeah, why he chose Atlanta. While we wait for Andre to get his Wi-Fi sorted out, Brentin, can you go ahead and kind of open up what the discussion we're looking at today, and also go ahead and introduce Carol and Liliana?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry. I would have intervened, but I actually thought it was me.
But I'm back.
Oh, you're back.
All right,
I'm back. I'm sorry about that. It just
You
cut
left
off.
us on the cliffhanger.
Yeah, you were about to explain why you chose Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, good. Very good. I chose Atlanta because so many of my friends moved to Atlanta from Pittsburgh in pursuit of opportunity. Lots of people. They made that migration down south. A lot of my research looks at how Black cities are formed, and many have formed not because of white flight. We constantly talk about white flight. There's a lot of cities in which the movement of Black people, particularly from the north to the south, caused growth in Black cities. Certainly, there's been a growth in the suburbs in and around Atlanta. And there's still actually, a lot of people may not realize this, but there's still large growth in Atlanta proper, but there's just more white people and Latinos moving in along with whites, which is diversifying Atlanta proper. But people are flocking to Atlanta proper. They're flocking to the suburbs. It's a booming metropolitan area. But if we don't have folks maximizing the assets that are at their disposal, they will not be able to reach the American dream that they're trying to seek. And so I'm going to leave it there because I really want to get into conversation, but there's a lot of assets that are undervalued in Atlanta. And I want to see the great metropolis really reach its potential by honoring the value of Black lives. And when we do, you'll see property values increase. So thank you very much. At this time, I'm going to bring in a friend and colleague, Brentin Mock, who is a writer with CityLab. And he's going to introduce some of the folks who are going to talk about Atlanta and my book moving forward.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm Brentin Mock. I'm a writer and editor with CityLab.com, and we cover basically all things cities. Um, I've done a bunch of stories on the formation of Black cities, particularly around Metro Atlanta. Well, about the creation of Black cities and also the creation of white cities, so to speak, around Metro Atlanta. And you know, longtime friend of Andre Perry. Thanks so much for allowing me to help spread the word about your much needed book, Know Your Price. Um, you can go to citylab.com and you can actually read an excerpt of Andre's Know Your Price book. It's called This Is How Hard It Is to Invest in Black Neighborhoods. And it's an excerpt from his chapter on Birmingham, Alabama. But let's not talk about Birmingham. We're going to talk about Atlanta. Real quick, let's also introduce our fellow panelists. Carol Naughton, who is executive director at Purpose Built Communities, and they are an organization that helps local organizations and local leaders empower and bring investment to struggling neighborhoods. And then we also have Liliana. I'm sorry, I really don't want to mess up your name.
Want to see. I'll see. Just sound it out phonetically. You got this.
Okay, Liliana Bakhtiari.
There you go. See, you got it.
Did I say it? Okay. All right. And then she is a community organizer and advocate, works with Partners for Home, which is the city's nonprofit to manage the Atlanta continuum of care for homeless services. So thank you all for joining us in this conversation. And let's start with the question of just pretty much like why people who know anything about Atlanta, they believe that it's a Black city, or it's a chocolate city or whatever. Well, how is it, people probably want to know, how is it in a Black city that Black homes are devalued at a much less lower value than white homes in this city? Anyone want to tackle that question?
Well, I'm gonna allow the good panelists to go after. Then I'll give you a little bit of what I perceive and what I write about in the book.
Carol, why don't you kick that one off, and then I'll give my opinions on that one.
Sure. It's a great question, and I think the answer comes back to the systemic policies that were adopted at every level of government, federal, state, and local over the last 100 years that were designed to make life harder for Black people than for white people, and those are applied even in cities with majority Black populations, maybe even with more intentionality in cities with high levels of Black population. So I don't think the number of folks who live in a community was protective of creating a bulwark against those intentionally malintended policies that were designed to stop the acquisition of wealth, to limit where Black people could live, to stop the ability to be able to get good, favorable financing on housing. I think it's all those same kinds of policies applied in Atlanta like they did in lots of other places, almost every other place.
Yeah, and to go off of that, I mean, again, Atlanta's been referred to as Black Mecca, but we have we don't just have a racial issue, we have a socioeconomic one. And in which people, whether, even if they are a higher income and Black population, those same individuals, people that are of higher income in the city, as in most places, have profited off of keeping lower income Black Atlantans lower income. And so we have a city that's been designed on racist tactics. You look at our highways, you look at the way that they were designed, you look at how they were intentionally put in place to separate Black and white neighborhoods. Reynoldstown, first neighborhood established by freed slaves, now completely taken over by white people. You take a look at the way that the market has worked, and it's not just, to go off of what Carol says, it's all of those issues and the sheer fact that you take a look at what's happened in Atlanta, which is supposed to be Black Mecca, but we see here greater impacts of modern day colonialism, which intentionally you've had businesses and white folks and people of richer class, like richer upbringings, intentionally keep Black people in food deserts that are, that are experiencing medical apartheid, that are experiencing transportation deserts, intentionally keep them poor, and intentionally keep their property listings low and property values low, so they can come in and be like, oh, look, you are living in a historic area, you've made nothing of it, now let me show you how to do something with it. Even though that title of revitalize, or an area to intend, like as if there's this indication that no one lived there. No, people have been living there. Black businesses have been operating there since the 70s or 60s, but people have not considered it safe to go there. And again, it's because those areas were intentionally kept in isolation. And then we then criminalize the people that are brought up in those communities for being the product of the environment that we forced them into. So again, a lot of that has, that has a lot to do with it as well. And just because we're in Black Mecca, there's a lot of parts of Black Mecca that are absolute facades. But yes, we do have a greater population of Black people here. It does not mean that just because we claim to be the birthplace of the civil rights movement, that we are doing everything we can to uphold and protect our Black legacy.
And for me, let's be clear that the same attitudes that led the officer to in Minneapolis to choke out George Floyd are the same attitudes harbored by people in the various markets impacting housing all over the country. And so when you think, yes, there are certainly Black middle class folks in Atlanta, but let's be clear, the folks who are doing the lending, the folks who are doing the appraisals, the real estate agent behaviors, a lot of those people still have the same negative attitudes about Black people those are the things that create an uneven housing market. And so, and let's be clear, the days of Maynard Jackson have long since passed. Everybody brings up the airport and how it was leveraged properly to advance Black wealth and Black growth. But the reality is Atlanta hasn't had that same type of investment in Black people in a long time. Yes, relative to a lot of other cities, Atlanta is doing better. But but there's been a lot of opportunities to build wealth that has not bled into Black communities. And so we got to be honest about that. And that's not an indictment on any one mayor. But clearly folks bring up Maynard Jackson like it was 4 years ago. And that was a long time ago. So a lot of investment has not happened in Atlanta, and it should.
And I think the other piece is people also forget when we talk about like the predatory lending practices, the pieces that you're taking place, people have no idea how far back that predatory lending, those plans are put in place. When you take a look at some of the families in the Old Fourth Ward, I was the few that I was working with that had predatory lending practices, loans they never should have qualified for, but they didn't know about. And you find out that some of their lenders were coming to their kids' birthday parties, were familiarizing themselves with these families, were making themselves like we're making sure to earn the trust of these Black families that didn't have the understanding of what they were being led into. And then you had their debt sold over and over and over again until they paid the value of the house 4 or 5 times over and were still in debt. And then that house in turn gets claimed by the bank when that person then passes away, and then sold for 6 figures to a white family.
Yeah. And look, and if I can just add on to that, there are people talk about the number of corporations in Atlanta, but a lot of them are paying terrible wages, little benefits, and still, let's not forget, as was mentioned, poverty is still a major factor in Atlanta. Again, we talk about Atlanta being Black bougie heaven, but it's also a place where there's significant pockets of poverty, particularly in the city. And so it's not, it's hard to talk about because we certainly see wealth, we certainly see economic mobility, but we also see that tale of two, that other tale of that we talk about when we say the tale of two cities. We see the stark poverty, and we see the lack of investment in poor Black folk in and around Atlanta.
So I think
Andre,
we sometimes believe the marketing, that we believe the hype. And, when we see, research from somebody like Raj Chetty, who identifies really what the likelihood of moving from the bottom of the economic food chain to the top is during your life, and Atlanta's being only 4%. When we look at that kind of data, it shines a light on these, gross inequities and opportunities. And that's really what, to me, it is. It's the gross inequity and opportunity that is embedded in all of this, from whether we're talking about education, property, and other kinds of opportunity.
Okay. I think we got the next title for your next book, Andre. Atlanta, Black Bougie Heaven. I got to do that one. When we talked the other day, I think it was Carol. I think you were the one that brought up that when it comes to, say, the way that we do affordable housing, that there may be a bug in the system. That when we're talking about how to generate wealth for lower income people, that the suppression of home values could have a perhaps unintended consequence when it comes to generating wealth. You want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, I think there's some unintended consequences when we think about housing affordability and land prices and the issues that Andre has raised in his book. I was on a call the other day with a group of affordable housing advocates for about an hour and a half, and it was a really good call with people doing wonderful work. But in the entire hour and a half, nobody's thinking about how do we creating wealth? How are we creating opportunities for people to leverage the assets, both that they might own and other assets in their community? We're not talking about how do we create funds for lower income people to be able to invest in, to be able to capture some of the value that's being created in the neighborhoods in which they live, partly because they're being great neighbors and they're spending money in their neighborhood, so that we don't have those kinds of mechanisms. We're thinking so much about affordability right now that we're not thinking about these other kinds of issues. And when you're thinking about developing affordable housing, I have lots of good friends who are developers and trying to do a really good job at delivering high quality affordable housing. But when land prices are low, that's what creates an opportunity to do affordable housing. It's so much more difficult to do affordable housing if you're paying top dollar for land. And so the whole system is designed to find places where property values are low and then frankly keep them low. There's not a lot of incentive to be building up property value and wealth based on the way that we finance affordable housing and select the sites.
Go.
I was going to say, sorry, Andre, thank you. To that point, it's also the areas of land, so the areas of land that are kept low, because we do have some of the fastest growing land prices in the country. And we take a look at Memorial. Remember the days of Memorial Drive where nobody was going down there? Now it's upwards, we're talking seven figures for a plot of land on Memorial. And it's the areas in which we are talking about what Carol said, like the areas where land is affordable or lower priced, only further segregates poverty. So we're talking about putting affordable housing in areas where there isn't transportation, where MARTA services have been cut, where there aren't, it isn't mixed income. That's not happening. So you're still cutting off those resources, and you're still further segregating and politicizing poverty and further keeping it out of the eye of the public. So therefore, they're still othered. There's not an understanding around it. When Peachtree and Pine shut down and people said they wanted to buy, shelters, everybody was up in arms about Peachtree and Pine shutting down. However, when it came to building that same stuff in their backyard, that same shelter in the backyard, they would not have it.
That's right.
And so, and again, just because we have stigmatized the idea of poverty and homelessness, there's a reason we haven't seen a MARTA expansion since the year it was built in 1979. There's a reason it still looks the exact same as when it was built. These are not accidents. And so again, we have land that's very expensive and you can build there, but then we have the issue of what we're again seeing on Memorial where land is so expensive, developers are building like this, and the next crisis we're going to have on our hands is that we've been building with less than subpar material, and these buildings are going to be coming apart in the next decade. And then what do we do? So there's a number of issues on how to, one, adapt to a ever increasing changing market in which prices are going up and down, not sometimes like in a much shorter time frame than I have in the past. And how do we adapt to that? And how do we, again, keep things affordable? So, because I remember when the A&P lofts were built and that was affordable. Now those people are out of there, and those lofts are going on Memorial are going for 10 times what they were originally built for. And they were initially built to be affordable. And then again, of course, we had the city's definition of affordable and area median income, and then we have what is actually needed. And so, how do we tackle those issues?
Yeah, and for me, I've been struggling with this for a long time. We need housing for housing's sake, and not necessarily for wealth building opportunities. We do need people to be able to generate wealth, and we certainly should have a conversation about wealth generation beyond housing. But we're now in a place where we have too many people that because of these large swings in the market are being constantly pushed out of neighborhoods that they've been in for a long period of time. And so we need new products, new housing products, new mortgage products, more different housing opportunities that anchor people into place, but maybe not necessarily generate wealth. Because what my fear is that there is, people are so vulnerable to these economic shocks in their communities that they never get a chance to anchor themselves and really establish themselves. And so, and it's difficult to bring affordability without reducing the ability to generate wealth. But with that said, clearly I want every person to be able to have some wealth. I want every person, but for me, housing is a human right that at some point we need to figure out ways to have people be able to live where they're working. And too often folks want Black people and brown people's labor, but they don't want them to be neighbors. And so that has to change. That has to change, because people are now being pushed out of, miles and miles away from where they work, and it's not sustainable. So you see it a lot on the West Coast, where it's just, now it's hard to even be a teacher and work in San Francisco.
It's hard to even be a doctor and work in San Francisco.
That's exactly right. And so the point is, we do need to figure out ways to anchor people in communities that may not necessarily lead to wealth building, and directly, because I always argue being able to predict where you're going to be over 5 years is a luxury that can help you establish wealth in other areas. But
So I think you're right about that housing stability. So, unfortunately, there's not one answer, right? We're never going to find just like a silver bullet that works in every place, everywhere. And I think we're going to be doing balances and some trades to try to create kind of a range of equitable solutions that will respond to the needs of families at different points in their lives. To your point about housing stability, think about how important housing stability is for children in school.
Yeah.
Every time a child changes schools, they lose a year, is what the research shows us, right? And so if you have to move every couple of months or even every year, it's really difficult for that child or that community's school to be able to move forward and provide a child with the kind of opportunity that every child deserves. So if we tie housing stability and to education, there may be some opportunities there to tie those things together to create better opportunities for families to be anchored in place at those critical years in their children's lives.
Which, is that point, education kind of is it's the foundation of so much, so investing in our youth. But then you take a look at what's happening with the pop-up charter schools and private schools, which of course I'm not going to say like, absolutely not. But the result of so many pop-ups of these schools has absolutely resulted in the under enrollment in public schools, because you have white parents that are pulling their kids out of that because they have the ability to be more involved in, they have the money and the ability and the capital and the resources to be more involved in a private school and ensure their child is getting more of a quality education, which in turn a black parent who might be a single parent who might have whatever not have access to the same resources, or lives in Section 8 housings like we saw happening in Edgewood Courts with the shutdown of Whiteford Elementary. And then you have those kids that are then relocated to Toomer or pushed off elsewhere, and their entire life is uprooted. And then at the same time, they don't know what's going on, they don't understand why. And then Toomer is also unenrolled, but also the teachers there are having, you're having 25, 30 students per teacher. Whereas, at a charter school, those numbers are like, it's a third of that per teacher.
That's actually not quite
well,
accurate,
some of them, but yes, but like we have the differences. We do have the struggle with APS or public schools being able to stay open and compete because of the fact that there's a severe under-enrollment. We saw that a lot in Southeast Atlanta, where kids are being moved from school to school, and the change up of that. And yes, and I would love to see every student be able to get into a charter school that's available. But the fact is that we are facing issues with that, and we are facing issues with our public school teachers being able to even afford to live in the city, or our first responders being able to even afford to live in the city. And then you have the issue with not investing in trade programs. So we had the one trade school that shut down because we didn't invest the less than $1 million that was needed to keep it open. And so there you go into not being able to retain members in the local economy. And then that leads to the issue of Georgia or corporations in Atlanta saying, well, we don't have builders here, we don't have developers, we don't have people here to do the labor, so they outsource, which then in turn drives up costs here, and then in turn continues to have rising levels of unemployment and underserved populations, when in fact a lot of people that live on the street that are homeless that I've worked with are carpenters, are electricians, or plumbers that have those trade backgrounds, but were never able to find work, and now they've resorted to other pieces. But we don't have an investment in retainment and not just producing to give away is something that I've found that Atlanta has. Is like we produce a lot of things, but then we lose what we produce to other cities because they have more opportunity.
Let me just quickly, because I know, and this might be somewhat of an aside, but I know, Brentin, I think you reported on the impact of charter schools on housing prices in some cities. There is a correlation with the number of charter schools and the increase in housing prices. But I'm very critical of reform, but reform in this respect, that because of housing segregation, because of our structure in which we fund education, a significant part of that through property taxes, many schools with Black and brown students get significantly less. Nationally, schools that are majority people of color get $23 billion less than their majority white counterparts. And why do I say that? If you don't address that issue, you're constantly going to blame the school board, you'll blame the teachers, you'll blame the students for inequality, when in fact there's a larger structural issue here. One of the reasons why I write about housing is because so much of how we pay for education is that, but we're constantly picking on teachers and school leaders and other folks, when in fact we never get at the structures that cause inequality. So for me, it's like, let's get at these overarching structures, or we're constantly going to be shuffling schools and doing this and that. And that's not necessarily the problem. The problem is we have significantly underfunded schools created by a property tax structure and housing segregation that has really hurt a lot more than education.
Amen.
Speaking of education, we should acknowledge the moment, which is that we're in the middle of this pandemic, which has led to schools closing, which means a lot of children kind of losing that time that you spoke about, Carol, at least to the extent that they're not getting the education that they would have got while in the classroom. And then there were also the uprisings that happened in Atlanta, which is effectively led to the closings of a lot of businesses, you know, if not also, I assume, impacted the homelessness issue. Might have in fact been a statement on the homelessness issue itself. Liliana, you want to kind of talk about how the impacts of the pandemic and the recent uprisings are complicating or impacting the kind of work that you all are doing to help kind of preserve struggling Black neighborhoods
I
or
mean,
poor neighborhoods?
yeah, of course. I mean, what we've seen is like an exacerbation of underlying issues, greater spotlight shone on what we've already, you know, things that have already, you know, things that already exist. The struggling infrastructure we already have in place for lower income Black communities. So, you know, things like food deserts, things like the, you know, like the prison industrial complex, things like our drug epidemic, and things like, you know, medical apartheid, Black families not having the same access to medicine or transportation, and being exploited and redlining, and a number of other things, or people that live a paycheck away from the street that are now, I've been getting calls from people who have now gone from having housing they had just gotten placed, that are back in their cars because they've lost jobs. And so the issue that this has shown is that a lot of the people that are on the street, and because they've been on the street, we have so many members that are chronically homeless. A lot of them have turned to, of course, because of their conditions, a lot of them, one, have failing health issues. Like I'm talking like high blood pressure, respiratory problems, everything else, that are already high risk because they're living on the street and because of the number of health issues, and because Black people statistically, because of the way they're raised, have access to less food, less health, you know, that are in areas that don't, you know, that don't have the resources needed to live a healthier life, end up dying earlier irregardless, and then add homelessness on top of that. And then of course, a lot of them have turned to things like drugs and alcohol to get by. So a lot of the chronically homeless, we have severe substance abuse issues, and also PTSD and mental, you know, they have mental illnesses that are going unaddressed, and there are just none of those resources to take care of that. So instead of, so it's like, hey, let's put you in a house and you're going to be fine. When in fact, a lot of them do not have the life skills or the health to maintain that type of responsibility. And so it's like one thing to give someone a home, but if you're not equipping them with the life skills, the understanding of holding a job, of dealing with their mental illnesses, of taking care of their health issues, because a lot of them don't have the safety nets they need, or families or other resources to help them because they have chronic illnesses, then they're not going to be able to keep their home. So we're, you know, there's one thing to house someone. It's another thing to begin addressing the fact that we know we do have the heroin capital of the U.S. here. We do have a crack epidemic. We do have issues with AIDS spreading, while, you know, our AIDS and HIV problems throughout Atlanta. And so it's such a multi-tiered issue, and we don't have that. We don't have the ways of addressing that. Georgia really doesn't have rehab facilities. We don't deal with substance abuse here. We don't really talk about it. And instead we criminalize it and punish it. And so,
I just want to add that the chapter in my book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. There's a chapter on Detroit where I talk about the death of my father. My father ultimately was murdered in a Detroit prison. He was a drug addict. He acted violently when he was using, and he was in and out of prisons. But when I went for the research for this book, I went to the areas in which he lived. And this is another reason why I talk about housing devaluation. He lived in areas in which there was significant housing devaluation, substandard schools, a lack of resources for things like rehab and other things. He simply did not have the resources to rebound, and the behaviors he participated in were criminalized. And so all of those things factor in. You know, the reason why we need resources before someone gets to that point where they're homeless, drug addicted. I mean, we've got to curb that by making sure that folks have the resources long before you get to that point, because then it becomes a very costly investment to deal with when it gets to that far along. And so we need to make sure that people have live in just areas, parts of the city, or we're always going to have these kind of problems at the end of the day.
Because when, as you were saying, like once you get to that point, once someone has been on the streets, chronically ill, developed an addiction, all of these things, and then they go through the shock of having to be put into a shelter and having all of a sudden never having the structure in place to being given structure, there is an adaptation period. There is PTSD that will be dealt with. There is a lack of understanding of why that system exists and why you're doing this for them. Because a lot of the people that I've worked with that live on the street, and many of us, for example, that have undergone any type of trauma, and I used to be homeless, you question everything. You don't trust it because the experience is if you're here to help me, you're not going to stay. This is temporary. So nothing is sustainable in that world. So why trust it? Why, and so you don't let go of your coping skills because you think that you think it's only temporary. And so there's trust building that has to take place. There's other things that have to take place. You can't just house someone. Great, you found a house. That person will be out on the street again because they will not be able, what I have found is they will not be able to keep that. We have to we're not addressing mental illness. We're not addressing PTSD. We're not addressing the fact that we're talking of years of degradation of dignity, which is just as harmful internally as a physical wound. And so these are bigger issues that, again, preemptively handled can be avoided, but we don't, preemptive healthcare is not something that's talked about in our country, let alone our city. And it's just not that, and especially not preemptive mental illness. This is a conversation that's only become more common in bless you, and protesting spaces. So, that's taking care of oneself. I remember there was a gentleman that was homeless that came in. He goes, I'm tired of using the restroom in my pants. I'm tired of not having access to a regular restroom. I'm tired of it. I'm nothing. I've been shown I'm nothing. And why would you help me? Because I deserve nothing. And the worst thing I've ever seen that's almost irreparable in the homeless community, in any community, but especially the homeless or individuals experiencing homelessness, is when they start losing hope and you just see the light go out of their eyes. And to come back from not having any hope or any faith is a very difficult thing to do. And we break them of that. In most cities, but especially here, I feel like we break them of that.
Can I just put an exclamation point on that? When people's value is robbed, when they are not valued, when their property, their belongings, their surroundings are not valued, people lose hope. There's no question about it. People lose hope, and they have reason to.
That's right.
And that is what ultimately what I'm trying to do. We need to value people. And when we do, we'll find ways to value property. We'll find ways to value services. But at the end of the day, I write a book about property, but it's really about valuing people. How can we learn how to value people? And
Andre, I love that. That was I'm not all the way done with your book, but I have loved that you have tied these things together, right? That we can't think about really getting property valued at the right way until we start valuing people the right way. And I love the chapter you wrote on Atlanta, which is really about Black women and the leadership of Black women. Could you talk just for a minute? I think people would really appreciate hearing a little bit of this on this call.
Yeah, I talk of and it's the chapter, it's titled "For the Sake of America, Elect a Black Woman President." And I worked with an organization called Higher Heights. They try to put Black women in office. And we did a lot of analysis. And one thing I found is that Black women have simply greater crossover appeal because they are on the upper echelon of education, and in some respects in business. They're making strides in electoral politics, and they're doing it in non-majority Black areas. So you have the Ayanna Presleys, you have the London Breeds. And I say this, that we should find Black women who have this vantage point of they're the lowest paid in terms of when you look at gender and race, but they also show promise and prestige in the upper levels. And the rise of Black women in politics really reflect their vantage point to see, to touch all aspects of society. And so I'm very encouraged by the prospects of Stacey Abrams as a VP. Kamala Harris is a VP. I mean, there's several other names. But the point of it is that Black women have been, in terms of electoral politics, shut out because of gender and race. But now we're seeing their value is there. We need to invest in Black women in electoral process. It should not be the, you know, last minute DNC. And let's be clear, that's what happened with Doug Jones and the election. In that special election, what was it, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, against Roy Moore. It happened in Louisiana in the governor race. John Bell Edwards was going to lose that race until the Black women in New Orleans, Shreveport, and Baton Rouge stepped up, particularly New Orleans. And so it can't be this wait to the last minute to invest in Black women. And this is the other thing, not to get too much in the weeds, but these presidential races are opportunities to make money and to build companies and wealth. There's hundreds of millions of dollars spent in these campaigns that go into local TV ads, get out to vote thing. We need to direct that money towards Black women, and we need to elect Black women. And that's how you maximize that asset, so to speak. But it's really to say, hey, Atlanta has leaders there that are constantly undervalued, and we need to invest in Black women, and not just, you know, I led that chapter with the current mayor, but we need to look at Black women in all areas, in all, not just Atlanta, but everywhere, and invest.
And redefining. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I particularly like that you've identified investing in Black women both as activists and leaders in running campaigns and running the businesses that support campaigns, as well as the candidates. I mean, there's two ways. It's not just the one who's running, right? Let's invest broadly and deeply.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And for me specifically, it's, you know, Black women and Black trans women, because we have so many Black trans leaders in Atlanta that are extraordinary. And honestly, Atlanta's rare in the fact that you give an activist a shoestring budget and they can make a revolution happen. You know, so it's just like,
that's right.
we operate off of very little.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So
sounds like,
and it's also redefining the term of viability, because when people use the term viable, it has so much inherent racism in it to me, and how we determine what is viable. And that needs to be completely thrown out and redone, you know, and rebuilt again, because again, you're saying last minute, it's because they would rather, you know, using Black women as a last minute resort to save a white candidate that was ill thought out to begin with and ill invested in to begin with. It's time to stop making Black women and Black trans women and just black people in general backup plans.
You know, because this is reality that Doug Jones could have very well been a Black woman. You know, like
Maybe should have been.
Yeah, should have been. You know, like, so yeah. Sorry, Brentin, go for it.
no, I was just gonna say, I think Joe Biden is hearing you all loud and clear. He needs to hurry up and pick Keisha. Mayor Keisha, don't wait till the last second for his selection.
I would love for him to pick Stacey, because, you know,
Or Stacey. Oh, I forgot about Stacey.
You forgot about Stacey.
I know.
Can't forget about Stacey. Don't forget about Stacey.
Edit that line out of this. Oh my God. I did not forget about Stacey. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I mean, just it's true that Georgia is the battleground state of 2020, and honestly, I don't think there's a path to the White House for Republicans without Georgia. So, if you know, if he needs to pick a candidate that can carry the South, so Stacey, and she'd be a great VP, and she'd win on the White House.
Hey, Brentin, I hate to switch gears here, but I wanted to make a quick announcement for the folks in Atlanta. I want to let them know that I'm partnering with Ashoka And we are going to have a $1 million competition for folks who want to work on housing devaluation. We recognize that these problems won't be solved until we find people who are proximate to the problem from local communities to address them. But we also need to invest in those people and solutions. And so we're raising money so that we can look for people in Atlanta who are working on these problems, people who are proximate to it. And so we will be announcing folks who want to enter this competition, and they will work with folks all over the country on this issue. But the goal is really, I mean, I hate to use the word competition sometimes, it's really to convene a group of leaders from around the country who are working on these issues of housing affordability, accessibility, all and devaluation. And so I just wanted to be clear that this book tour is not just about me waxing poetic about the book. It's just a device, a tactic, so I can talk to people like Liliana and Carol, so we can see, hey, there are people in Atlanta that deserve investment. Let's find them. Let's find them and let's incentivize. And so I just wanted to make that announcement to those who are interested in following my work. Know that in the upcoming months, we will be announcing this $1 million prize competition with Ashoka and Brookings, the Brookings Institution.
Love that.
Carol, you want to partner with me and apply?
Let's talk.
So I actually have a question for all three of you real quick, if that's okay.
That's okay.
So
sure, I think we have 5 minutes left. Are we still running?
Yeah, we have 5
okay.
minutes.
it's
All
a
right,
real,
great. Yep.
So the issue of housing and affordability, like as we said before, there's not one universal solution, especially not in areas where every city is so diverse. You know, we certainly aren't LA or San Francisco or Seattle or Portland or, you know, or Asheville or Austin or any of these things. So every city is completely different, completely demographics, completely different everything, and the way their financial structures work. So if you're going to coach someone or explain to a community how housing affordability should work, how would you, because Atlanta loves to refer to other cities as examples of what we should, you know, do. But how do we begin tackling the issue here? Because I have heard from so many politicians, like they're just simply, I've heard everything from like, we simply don't have the land to like, yeah, to, you know, we just don't know how, like, what do you think? They just don't have answers. Or there's like, hey, we should do rent control, which we know can be very ineffective and give a landlord excuse not to meet certain codes. And, you know, there are a number of different issues with that. So my question is, how would you begin tackling it here?
Well, for me, this is why we're having this Ashoka competition, because I really do believe we're not going to find a solution by somebody thinking or going into think tank mode and discovering something. I think there are multiple levels, multiple solutions. We need folks who working on housing affordability explicitly, but we also need people who are going to work on the general job market and making sure people have living wages. Because for me, this might be very simplistic, but I always envisioned cities where if you can work there, you should be able to live there. Mm-hmm. And so for me, if you are I don't care if you're a grocery store clerk or if you are a head of a bank, if you're working in Atlanta contributing, you should be able to live there. There should be space for you. And this is the other reality. City leader or municipalities are still by far and away the largest real estate holders in a place by far and away. And it's really incumbent upon city governments to zone for affordability, density, and all of those things. And oftentimes it's really about, you know, I'm glad, I love this conversation about defund the police, because it forces us to reprioritize our spending and our thinking about how a city should run. And this idea that, you know, only the wealthy people should be able to live together while poor people are working, or literally poor people are working in the same space, that's crazy. So for me, it might be simplistic, but I want people, if you can work in a place, you should be able to live there. But this is going to require market solutions and regulatory policy solutions. We need government solutions, but we also need market-based solutions. And that's what we're doing with the Ashoka Challenge, is to find both of those.
Yeah, I'd also think there's a role for philanthropy, potentially, on land acquisition. You know, control the land, control your destiny. And thinking about how we can control land and then figure out how to deploy it in a way that is not completely governed by just, you know, capitalism run amok. But how are there ways that we can build in permanent affordability while creating other opportunities for people to build wealth and design, you know, a whole system that is likely to meet the needs of people at different points in their lives. And philanthropy is more nimble than the government. Other problems associated with it, but it's an opportunity.
And you know, and our perspective is we need all of these players to be at the table and contribute. You know, like the private sector, government, as well as philanthropy,
as well as public advocates and everything else.
Public, that's exactly right. Exactly.
They end up, the most important role they play is humanizing the issue. Because we do a lot of talking about issues and talking about the people who need help, and we don't talk to the people who need help. We're very good at talking about them. We're not good at talking to them.
But let's be clear, advocates bring solutions.
Yes, they do.
Like that's where a lot of great ideas come from. They're just not invested in the same way. So our goal is to find those types of solutions.
I love it.
That
well,
sounds like
no, go ahead, Brentin.
No, go ahead. Take us out.
I was just gonna say thank you to Carol and Liliana for sharing their time, and to you, Brentin, for moderating. And Andre, thank you for writing this book. I will volunteer to listen to you wax poetic any day you'd like, and maybe on the sequel on Bougie Black Atlanta. And for all of you that are on the call, we'll be sharing a recording of this call for everyone who's here, and you know, make it a shareable link with Brenton's comment about Stacy edited out, of course. And
yes, please.
Please. As well. I know someone asked if it's on Kindle, so we'll have to. Andre, do you know if it's on Kindle?
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Okay.
I have it.
Perfect. Okay, cool. We'll have both the physical link to the physical book, and then also a copy to the Kindle link.
Andre, they asked if you could hold your book up closer to the camera. Can you?
Oh yeah, my bad. Know your price. It's $24.99. I know my price.
Well, we know its price.
It's $9.99 on Kindle, I think.
Great.
Awesome. Cool. We'll get that out to everyone. Brentin, do you have any parting words, you or Andre?
Also go to CityLab.com to read the excerpt so that you know to buy the book.
Yeah, that's right. But look, that CityLab excerpt, why is it so difficult to invest in Black communities? Man, that thing probably sold me 1,000 books. I'm not kidding you.
It was a great piece. Thank you.
We will send you a bill. You are on the record saying that.
On the record. All right, y'all. Talk to you soon, and thank
you.
So much for making
Great to meet you all. Enjoyed it.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Brentin.